Yeah, hi there. Um, in today's discussion, we will focus on how people evolve into nations and why Scandinavia did not become one nation, and instead it evolved in three different nations. So, I and Nikolai Brandal will discuss these questions. And I am Farhat, Associate Professor at the University of Tromsø. And Nikolai Brandal is a Norwegian historian, Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Bjørknes University in Oslo, Norway. And the reason I requested Nick to join this discussion is because Nick has wide research experience on the Nordic region, including, of course, Scandinavia. And Nick has widely published on the region and also on some other parts of Europe in form of books, edited books, and research articles. And the themes that he covers includes, but are not limited to, the Nordic model, of course, including Scandinavia, the First World War, and political extremism. So welcome, Nikolai.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here. And before I go to Nick, I just would like to put a little bit of context on the discussions. You see, nation is a relatively new idea, evolved in the last few centuries. It is a post-Westphalian idea. Before this time, we did not have nations as we know them now. We had big empires. For example, in the Islamic context, we are familiar with the word called ummat, which is a large community based on religion, but it recognizes no distinctions based on ethnicity, culture, language, and geography. The same is the case with the other empires of the ancient worlds were similar. For example, the Romans and the Persian empires, they were large empires, large communities, which included people from different cultures, different regions, and geographies. And they were spanning over three different continents, these two empires of the ancient world. In the modern world, then in the last 2-3 centuries, the idea of nation emerged and it evolved, and then we see different groups of people evolve themselves into nations. And when we think of the idea of nation and in terms of classic definitions of political science, we see that there are some characteristics that are very peculiar to nations, and among them, important ones are common culture, including religion, common language, common geography. And now, when we look at this definition of nation, and when we look at Scandinavia, we see the Scandinavians have a common culture, religion, Protestant Christianity, common language, and geography is also common. But still, the Scandinavians did not become one nation. They evolved in three different nations. Why is that? That despite the commonalities, they became three different nations. Nick, your perspective on this?
Well, if I was to take a starting point, I would go to geography, and Norway and Sweden are facing in different directions. So Sweden is facing eastwards, Norway is facing westwards. So Norway has had an orientation towards the North Sea and towards the UK, towards Britain, towards the islands in the Atlantic, whereas Sweden has been oriented towards Finland, Russia, and to a larger extent also Germany. Denmark is also a westwards facing country, but also a southwards facing country, as they are landlocked with continental Europe. So they haven't had an orientation towards continental Europe, which Norway has not had to the same degree. And if you look at the transport routes between Norway and Sweden, even today, they are not that many. Currently, we see quite a bit of contact across the Norwegian-Swedish border, but that is a relatively new development. There were very few roads, there were very few train lines built. I mean, even today, there's 2 train lines between Norway and Sweden. The main transport route was built in I think in the 1950s or 1960s. So not that much intermarriage, not that much migration across the border, because most of it is either rugged mountains or woodlands, which does not make for easy travel. And then you can move on to economy. The economy of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are quite different. Denmark, much more agriculture. Norway has always been fishing, minerals, forestry. And then Sweden is sort of not sort of in the middle. They have some forestry, they have some quite a lot of industry, obviously, but again, the main reason why the union between Norway and Sweden fell apart in 1905 was that the need was about foreign policy, and it was about economic foreign policy, because the Norwegian economy was so different from the Swedish, that the fact that Norway was not allowed to have their own consular services overseas made it difficult, because Swedish economic interests were very different from Norway. So even if the languages are quite similar enough, we more or less understand each other, and the culture, religion is the same, basically. I think that if you look at geography and you look at the economies, that probably explains why they have not merged into one country.
Yeah, but they also have a shared history, a lot of it. For example, the Viking history is shared heritage of all the 3.
Well, when you say a shared heritage, again, that is they did not see themselves as Vikings in the Viking Age. The whole concept of Viking is also a relatively new development from the 19th century, part of the nation building process of the 19th century, when they sort of reinvented this golden age of the Vikings. The Vikings did not call themselves Vikings as one common denominator. And they had, again, the Swedes were traveling mostly down the European rivers into Russia, and to a much lesser degree go into the Atlantic, to the British Isles, or whereas the Danes and the Norwegians did not travel that much into Russia, but went to the UK, and yeah.
So then common culture, religion, they are not enough to make a nation. You have to have economy. People should be integrated in one way or the other way in economy, and also shared history that you said, the Viking history. Of course, there are differences in that, but still there is a history. They lived under one king, the Viking kings. So that too is not enough. So what is that that make a nation in the modern world that we have? Shared culture and language and religion is not enough. That I can conclude from this Scandinavian case. What else? What are the other ingredients that we need to make a nation?
I have a favorite quote from the French philosopher Ernst Renan, who said that a nation is a group of people who misunderstand their past and hate their neighbors.
Okay.
Which is sort of a flip comment, but there is something to that. In the misunderstanding the past thing is that you need people, leaders who take strategic decisions at opportune moments to create a national identity which is strong enough, and then you need to be a nation. The group needs to understand itself as different from someone else. So in Scandinavia, when Scandinavia has been pulled towards each other, it has been because they feared the Germans, the Germanic tribes, and then later the Holy Roman Empire. And so, but they've always been pulled apart because they have seen themselves as three distinct areas, territories. And that goes back to at least the 800s, when we had the first Norwegian kingdom. So even if the borders have shifted somewhat, there are areas today which in current Sweden there used to be Norwegian. There are areas. It's most of southern Sweden used to belong to Denmark, and obviously Iceland and the Faroe Islands used to belong to Norway, and then to Denmark, Norway, before they became independent. So, but there has been some core territories which have had an identity as being separate from Sweden or Denmark in Norway, and vice versa in Sweden and Denmark.
Despite common culture and common language, there was this sense of distinct identity from the other cousin.
Yes.
Yeah. So then again, I'm coming back to struggling to this construction of nation. So then economy, then distinct identity despite the similarity in culture or similar culture. Political decisions, you said that at appropriate time by leadership, and the ability, or whatever one would call it, to hate neighbors or misunderstand neighbors, and also institutions, the kind of empire or state they have been living with, and the relationship of institutions of that state with the people. Would that also play a role in creating distinct identities despite similar culture and religion and language?
Well, if you take Norway and Denmark as an example, they were in a union for 400 years until 1814, when Denmark was on the losing side in the Napoleonic Wars and lost Norway to Sweden. But that's a different story. So, and during that period, the distinct Norwegian institutions from the Viking era and the early Middle Ages became Danified. So they were replaced more and more with Danish institutions. So in 1814, most of the political institutions in Norway were Danish, similar to Danish. The language, the spoken language was Norwegian, quite distinct from Danish, but the written language was Danish. So if you had not had, if Denmark had chosen the right side in the Napoleonic Wars, it is possible that Norway and Denmark would have remained one country even today and emerged even closer together than they were in 1814. But because of the breakup and then being forced into a union with Sweden, which was never as close, and one of the results of the 1814 negotiations was that Norway got the political institutions back, and they got democratic institutions as well. So we then had a national bank, a national university, a national parliament, a new constitution, which was separate from the Swedish institutions. And the result of the 1814 solution is that politically Norway became a part of Sweden, or we were under the Swedish king. Culturally, we remained a part of Denmark. Norwegian books were published in Copenhagen in Danish. The authors continued to write in Danish. So we were culturally still a part of Denmark. And economically, Norway was a part of the British Empire by default, because we have always had a very open economy, lots of imports, lots of exports overseas, which means that whoever controlled the seas was our most important partner, and that was obviously the Royal Navy. So the Norwegian shipping industry sailed on the keel of the Royal Navy, but that gave lots of space for the Norwegian elites to triangulate, to weaken the cultural ties by emphasizing the political ties, to weaken the political ties by emphasizing cultural ties towards Sweden, and then obviously using the relationship with the UK to weaken the other two. So you then had a building of a national identity, which went simultaneously with building national institutions throughout the 19th century. So for Norway, it was almost the solution in 1814 was almost as good as it could have been, and became then a starting point for a really successful nation building.
Okay. Now, what I understand now from this discussion up until now, that the cultural fabric and same language and religion, they are not the most decisive factors in the construction of a...
We should probably make a point here about language, because both in all three countries there are very distinct dialects. And if you go back, you only have to go back like 50 years, there were probably people in Sweden who didn't understand each other. There were people in Norway who didn't understand each other, same in Denmark. So the dialects have always been very different. So there's not been one language. And for most Swedes, Danish is impossible to understand, because they have the sort of the glottal stop when they pronounce. So it's even if the written languages are similar, the spoken languages have not been that similar.
Yeah, but every language has dialect, so that's I think it's the same with every language. But just trying to understand that what are the most definitive ingredients that make a nation. So it's not a same culture or common culture, common religion, common language, of course, with different dialects. So then the political experiences that people have in relation to the empires or states under which they have been living, and they, of course, the decision of the leadership at appropriate times. This is more definitive. And you brought in the British Empire and Norway's association with that. And I was looking at your other paper in which you draw a similarity between Norway and Scotland, and how they went on different paths. And this is relevant because when people construct their self-image as a nation, then they also want to have a nation state. So then the Norwegians finally made a nation state, but not Scots. What was different here?
Well, I think again, when Scotland became a part or merged with England into the United Kingdom in the early 18th century, the Act of Union basically meant that Scotland lost all of its political and cultural and social institutions. What remained was the Church of Scotland only. And the Scottish nobility was Anglified, and London became the centre of the United Kingdom. So to move forward your career or your social standing, whatever, you had to go to London. So that when Norway was in the union with Denmark, the same went for Copenhagen. So all Norwegians had to go to Copenhagen. But in 1814, that bond was broken, while it remained in Scotland. Obviously, it was still, the Scottish elites were focused on London. The Norwegian elites after 1814 became focused on the capital of Norway, Oslo, rather than going. They still went to Copenhagen, but it became less and less important. They didn't go to Stockholm; that wasn't important. So the focus became inward towards building a nation. And for Scotland, throughout the 19th century, even when they got the cultural nationalism of Robbie Burns and his poetry, for example, there were no political institution or even cultural institutions aside the Church of Scotland which could be filled with the idea, which could turn cultural ideas into political ideas.
Or maybe the Scots were satisfied with their integration with Great Britain.
Difficult to say. They don't current day. They don't seem too happy about that. But it is an interesting fact that the Scottish independence movement didn't really gain traction until you had the Hollywood movies of the 1990s, like Rob Roy and Braveheart, which retold the story of the struggle for Scottish independence in the Middle Ages. So yeah, and,
exactly.
and that then led to a push for getting Scottish political institutions. So you got a new parliament, and you got devolved governments, which then became a force in itself for strengthening a Scottish national identity, which has led us to where we are today, where more than 50% of the Scottish population says that they want an independent Scotland.
Yeah, and with this mention of Scottish national identity and Scots, I recall this book, which is, how should I say this? The Pathans. It is written by Olaf Caro. He is known as Ulf Caro in Pakistan and India, but I think this is Olaf because the proper Scandinavian name is Olaf. So Olaf Caro, he was a famous British Indian administrator and governor of the northwest frontier province, which is now part of Pakistan and called Pakhtunkhwa, where Pashtun live. And he famously said in one of his speeches that Scots, that Pashtuns are Scots of Pakistan. Pashtuns are to Pakistan what Scots are to England. When we look at the Pashtuns, we see that part of them, a majority of them live in Pakistan and a part in Afghanistan. And the idea of Pashtun nationalism is very strong in Afghanistan, strong to the point that they hate Pakistan army, literally. Which is, of course, the strongest, most powerful institution, and also the dominant ethnic group there. They extremely, as you just mentioned, that you have to have a neighbor which you hate. So they have it in Afghanistan. But in Pashtun in Pakistan, they don't take them seriously. And they stand more integrated in Pakistan, especially in the state institution, in the army especially, which is, again, as I said, is a dominant state institution, also control a good deal of power. So I was also, with this discussion, trying to understand that the idea that is of Pashtun nationalism, of Pashtun nation, is so strong in Afghanistan, while it is not taken seriously in Pakistan. So what is the problem there? What is that constitute a nation? And when I was thinking of it, I thought of Scandinavia, and I said, okay, well, like Pashtun, you have common language, share culture, uh, dominant religion, a lot of geography, but the Scandinavians do the same. But Scandinavians evolved into three different nations. And why can't Pashtun then evolve into two different nations? Or what we can learn for the Pashtuns, where the area is still, situation in Afghanistan, it's in turmoil there, and it also affects the Pashtun in Pakistan. So if I could conclude it in this way, that, well, common culture, language, of course, dialects, and we have very many different dialects in Pashto language too. And just like the Swedes and Danes and Norwegians, sometimes some of the dialects are not understandable to people in the other Pashtun area. So language, culture, religion, and even geography, they are not the definitive factors.
I think that I don't have any great knowledge of Pakistan and Afghanistan, but it seems to me that somewhat similar situation is the Kurdish nation, and I don't think there are many today who have any hope for one Kurdish nation, and I don't think that they really want one Kurdish nation. What you have seen is the evolvement of distinct ideas of a Turkish Kurdistan, a Syrian Kurdistan, and an Iranian Kurdistan. Or is it Syria? Yes. So they seem to be on the same trajectory, or Kurdish nationalism seem to be on the same trajectory as the Scandinavian nationalism, moving into three different countries.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I see this thing, something like this in Pakistan, Afghanistan context too. But this is very interesting, and this was just to look into other parts in the world and see what we can learn. And with this discussion, I think there is, what I understand, there is a good news for Pakistan and a warning too. From what I can conclude, the good news is that if you integrate people in your state institution and in your wider society, you as a state can be comfortable that you are on the right path in making them or including them in a nation or making a nation out of them. And the Pashtun case actually underlines that. But at the same time, Pakistan also has Baloch, and they are very excluded, pretty much oppressed. There is an insurgency movement going on in Balochistan. So I think Pakistan needs to learn here and include the Baloch also. And for Afghanistan, I think they have to have the Afghan intellectuals, especially, they have to have a deeper, closer look at the history of nation construction in other areas, and see what they can learn from that. Hating Pakistan, hating Punjabis, hating Pakistan army will not lead anywhere. So perhaps Scandinavia is a good example to look, although of course it's a very different context from Pakistan, Afghanistan and Pashtun context. But since, as I said, in classical political science definition, this common culture, language, religion, geography, they are very strong ingredients for making a nation, and that we see in Scandinavia, but still they evolve in different nations. So we can see what can become of other nation. You mentioned the Kurdish examples. So am I right in this kind of comments, or you have further comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're basically you're right, but you also then have to. I would emphasize again the people aspect, the leadership aspect, that you get these national leaders within culture, within politics, who are able to sort of transcend the strives and the conflicts and move the group towards a common goal.
I have this comment, although it's not relevant with our discussion, but do you have something to say about this?
Yes.
Zero tolerance and peace.
In 1814, Norway had a pretty high level of corruption,
Okay.
certainly by European standards. 50 years later, it had almost vanished. And the best explanation I've seen for that is that a new group of leaders came into power after 1814, who were young, who were led by Enlightenment ideology, knowledge-based policy making, and who were uncorrupt. They then developed a functioning state which provided people with services, good services. So people were then, obviously, if the state provides for you, you are happy to pay your taxes. Obviously, the corruption, it didn't vanish completely, but it disappeared almost compared to the level it had been in the late 18th century, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, concluding comment, I will just say that it is good that nations are not constructed exclusively on based of religion, common religion, culture, language, because otherwise you see so many immigrants that we have, and actually every country has people from the outside, and they are getting citizenship, they are given citizenship. How would you make them part of the nation if the idea of nation has been so strict?
Yes, and we shouldn't make this out a totally romantic story of progress and happiness, because the Scandinavian states' relationship to their minorities is a problematic one, especially in the 19th century. So we obviously, the indigenous people of northern Norway and northern Sweden, the Sami people, that is one tragic story. But you also have the Norwegian travelers. You have the Norwegian gypsies, or the gypsies in all three countries, and a couple of other minorities. The Jews were excluded from entering Scandinavia until the early 19th century. When they were eventually allowed to gain entrance, obviously there was but a small population. Anti-Semitism was as prevalent in Scandinavia as in the rest of Europe. And during the Second World War, in Norway especially, Norwegian state institutions under Nazi occupation still were rather helpful when the Germans sent the Jews to the concentration camps. So again, I think all countries are struggling how to deal with a multicultural society within this Nordic framework. So what rights do you give people to be different? And you can say that the Nordic model, the welfare state model in the Scandinavian countries, it does not necessarily require homogeneity, but it certainly doesn't produce a plurality, a plural society, and it's sort of based on, and it's struggling with its relationship with the Human Rights Convention, because the Human Rights Convention gives everyone a right just by being human, whereas the welfare state gives you rights on the basis of being a citizen and a taxpayer. So these are constantly in conflict.
Yeah, very interesting, and these are the ideas that need more discussion, more time. But for now, thank you very much, Nick. This was very good. I've really wanted to put across your ideas to the audience, especially in Pakistan. We have this Pashtun nationalism very strong on one side of the border, and the other side, people do not care. So I just wanted to give them another example from another part of the world where people sharing similar culture, language, religion, geography to an extent evolved into three different nations. Thank you very much for being with me. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. And obviously, Pakistan, Afghanistan is a really interesting area, and is still situated in this very important sort of like crossroads between Asia and Europe, which obviously with the Chinese moving in with the Silk Belt Road initiative and all that is going to be important for the future of the world in the coming centuries, as it has been in the past.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.